India Development Debate. I'm Nayanthara Rai, coming to you from the national capital. Well, let's begin this show not with the New Year Grinch, but with some good news for the global economy at large. US President Donald Trump gave an update on New Year's Eve on the ongoing US-China trade tussle. Reuters says the first phase of the deal is set. January 15th will be the D-Day to ink the trade deal with China. Donald Trump tweeted this. I quote from his tweet. The US will be signing a very large and comprehensive Phase 1 trade deal with China on January 15th. At a later date, I will be going to Beijing, where talks will begin on Phase 2. That was the tweet put out on New Year's Eve by Donald Trump. The Phase 1 of the deal, announced on 13 December, has been agreed on that the US would suspend higher new tariffs on imports worth $160 billion. In return, China is going to buy more US farm products and make fresh commitments to improve intellectual property protection. The full terms of the 86-page agreement have still not been revealed. We don't have details of that. I guess it'll be made after much fanfare and a press conference from both the countries. Joining me to talk about what this means for the global economy and, of course, India is Alison Newton, the co-founder and director at Alavon Business Advisory, our very own in-house Maithili Bustermath, consulting editor at ET Now, Shogata Bhattacharya, the chief economist at Axis Bank. I'd like to thank all my panelists for joining us here on 1st of January. Wish all three of you and your families a very happy new year. It's starting off on a pretty good note. Global economy, one of the biggest threats for it has been this trade war. Maithili, I'll come to you first. Set the stage for what we're going to be discussing over the next couple of minutes here on the India Development Debate. Pretty good news coming in from Donald Trump on 31st of December. The deal will be signed on 15th of January. Good news for the global economy?
Oh, well, yes, it is good news for the global economy, and India also could do with some good news, because it's been a pretty dreary time for all of us in the global economy, except for the US, which is doing quite well. The rest of the global economy has really been suffering because of the US-China trade wars. But Nayanthara, remember, we're dealing with somebody like President Trump, and there's no guarantee that the man will actually stick to his words. He's been known to go back and forth on the same issue of the trade deal, and we really cannot take it for granted that what he's talking about, the large and comprehensive trade deal that he's tweeted about, will actually materialize. But to the extent that he has said something, we'll have to take it, even if we take it with more than a pinch of salt, maybe in a bucket of salt. It certainly is good news that the world would definitely look forward to. A good New Year gift is what I would say. Let's hope he walks the talk.
Okay, if I could now go across to Alistair for more on this. Alistair, of course, we have to see when Donald Trump goes to Beijing. We don't have the details of the Phase 1. They're going to work on the Phase 2 of the deal, as he has said. It's also election year in the US, considering that a large part of the presidency of Donald Trump has been on making America great again, bringing back jobs, making China the villain. You convinced that this is indeed going to happen?
The deal will happen, and I think it will happen for the point you've just made, that it is an election year. If you just consider what the implications of imposing those tariffs, which were threatened on the 15th of December, would have been, you realize that Donald Trump really does need this deal. Had those tariffs come into force, not only would they have been a significant hit on the US economy, they would also have been a de facto consumption tax, because the nature of the goods on which they were going to be imposed was largely consumer goods rather than product going into other industrial processes, as in the case of previous tariffs. Now, if you consider the fate of the last single-term president in the US, George H.W. Bush in 1992, he lost that election in significant part because of a slowing, actually in recession, US economy, and because he raised taxes. Donald Trump is no great historian, of course, but he has advisors around him who will have been pressing him very hard to focus on the fact that he does need the economy to be doing well come the 3rd of November. It's doing well at the moment, so all is set fair if things stay as they are. And he certainly doesn't need to be imposing de facto tax increases on American consumers, for which read voters. So I think phase one deal will happen. It won't be large. It won't be comprehensive. How could an 86-page deal, whatever it actually says, be large and comprehensive when one considers the sheer volume of most trade deals? And there will be no phase two deal before the election, in my view. Nevertheless, this is moderately good news, and the alternative of not having this deal would have been very bad news potentially.
Chokoto, that's Alistair Newton convinced that Donald Trump is indeed going to walk the talk. Having said that, for India, if I could get India specific at this juncture, we at India have been saying, let's exploit this trade war, let's use it to India's benefit. What do you think is going to be the impact of this phase one trade deal on India?
So, well, first, thank you for having me on the show. Wish you a very happy new year. I think I agree with Alistair that this is likely to go through. One, first, because I think President Trump, after the Powell put, the Fed cutting rates with the dollar falling, he thought he could be aggressive, but China turned out to be relatively much stronger than what President Trump had earlier thought, limiting the scope for negotiations with China. And as Alistair mentioned, many of the tariffs were very consumer facing, so that would have been a fair negative in an election year. So I think this is likely to go through in some way or the other. We await the details of the deal. So India is likely to be impacted in 2 or 3 different ways. One, of course, this is going to be to increase in whatever degrees, we do not know, a global risk on sentiment. I mean, the global economy has gone through roughly 2 years of a fair amount of uncertainty regarding the trade deal. I think gradually, I mean, it's not going to come off immediately, but gradually this level of uncertainty is going to come down. So the impact on global trade, global investment, global manufacturing that had been the direct outcome of the uncertainty, that is likely to gradually reduce, which is likely to be good for India. India needs to have as many growth engines functioning, and if the export engine begins to go up, I think that's good news. Second, I think because of the perception of risk on, I think global capital flows will begin to improve. I do not think the Fed or whatever QE is likely to ease in the near term. So that means excess capital available. So India is likely to be a beneficiary of those items. And thirdly, the larger items of the US-China agreement on investment, on strategic matters, etc., that's still not likely to go away in the near term. So India can still hope to try to attract companies that are looking to relocate out of China.
Maitri, if I could take that point forward, do you think you're going to have a lot of these disruptions going forward in this new year, right? You're going to have the trade deals, you're going to have the US elections, Brexit, all of that. How can India really seize the opportunity?
Nayantara, I think I seem to be in a minority over here because I really don't agree with Alistair at all. I think he's being very optimistic, pardon my saying so, because Trump has never been a person you can rely on. And even though as he says, that the tariffs should have, these are all consumer-facing items, but the fact is that the US inflation is still below 2%. The US economy, repeat, is in the longest period of expansionary phase. And we keep saying, yes, the US expansion will end now, but it doesn't seem to end. The rest of the world might not be growing, but the US economy is in pretty fine fettle. And despite all the fears, because we're talking about a trade war which has been going on for 18 months, it's not something that just happened yesterday. So the impact of this on consumer prices should have been felt by now, but it hasn't been felt. And Trump's traditional voter base, they buy into his argument of America first and all the arguments, the suspicion about China, the fact that China intellectual property rights protection is not as the US would desire to have it, that China is stealing its technology. So I'm really not sure that this trade deal will really materially change things. Yes, Trump has an eye on the US elections, and the fact is that soybean farmers, more than anybody else, more than the consumers, it is the soybean farmers who have been hurt, because China has basically cut back on its purchase of soybeans from the US. So I'm really not sure that Trump will live up to what he says. That is one. My second point on what you asked me about India, there was a lot of hope that when the trade war broke out, US companies would move out of China and India would be able to grab that space. But it hasn't happened. We've seen that not only has India lost out on the supply chain, entire mechanics of it, we have seen countries like Indonesia, Thailand, even Bangladesh move, take advantage. We've just not been able to get our act together. So I'm not sure that this will really make a difference. Yes, to the extent that uncertainty overall in global trade comes down, India will benefit, and exports are a powerful engine of growth. And in the past few years, we have not been able to benefit from that. So to the extent uncertainty comes down and global trade overall improves, India should be able to gain. But my sense is not very much. Sorry to be such a skeptic on the first of the year, but I'm afraid I remain a skeptical journalist.
Okay, Maithili, they're clearly a minority over there. She's not fully sold on the fact that we are going to see the signing of the first phase of the trade deal. We shouldn't jump the gun. Let's see when Donald Trump indeed does go to Beijing. But because it is also election year, Shogato, it is something that we have seen in the past, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, who will once again bring up Bengaluru. They were going to bring up BPOs. They're going to talk about how India charges an arm and a leg for importing Harley Davidsons. We should get ready that this is all going to be the talk right till election day in November of 2020. Given that, given Brexit, given the trade war or a trade deal, and as Maithili pointed out, India hasn't seized the opportunity. Is it going to become tougher for Narendra Modi, his cabinet, as well as his ambassadors around the world and the bureaucrats to ensure that we do see more factories being set up in India, that what is not going to the US or doesn't go to, to China actually comes to India?
Well, I presume that's for me, Nayantara, so I'll respond to this. Yes, I mean it's an uphill struggle, as Maithili mentioned. So we have not been hugely successful in beginning to pull some of the parts of the global value chain into India. Some have happened. I mean, whether it be part of the trade deal or whatever, we are beginning to manufacture more mobile phones in the country. I mean, for consumer durables, for air conditioners and refrigerators, we are setting up plants for manufacturing compressors in India, which used to be imported from abroad. So, I mean, there are some things which are happening, but some large ticket inflows into FDI or direct investment in the country, that hasn't happened so far. The fear is that, I mean, once the trade deal begins to happen, that companies will now again not stop thinking of relocating out of China, and we have already missed the bus on this over the last 18 months, 2 years or so. I think the government is talking, and I believe it is seriously looking at opportunities of talking to companies and trying to get them into India. I hope those initiatives continue. What I am saying is, other than all the benefits of reduced uncertainty, capital flows, exports, etc., I think we should still aim. I think there are enough geopolitical uncertainties in the China-US geostrategic in the dynamics between the two countries, and companies are still looking to diversify their production base out of China. We haven't been very successful so far, but I think the government focus, I presume there is a focus in the government, and I think this is likely to pay off. We should start attracting bigger companies who will pull in their entire supply chains. So I think that's the part that we need to be focusing on, irrespective of what the contours and the timelines of the trade deal really is.
Alistair, Maithili, on the panel with us, not in agreement that we are going to see that perhaps that trade deal go through. Do you want to explain to us again why you're so convinced that it is going to happen? Because the other way to look at it is, because it's election year, will Donald Trump want to become friends with China, convince his traditional vote back that more jobs could indeed be lost?
Donald Trump does not want to be friends with China. He wants to be friends with Xi Jinping, which is not quite the same thing. I actually agree with Maithili that you cannot take Donald Trump at his word in the vast majority of circumstances, and there is an element of doubt about this, to be totally fair. But I do think there are compelling reasons for supposing that this deal is actually going to go through. there's plenty of other things he can do to hurt China. And the focus of attention in the US, in Washington at least, is far more on the technology war today than it is on the trade in goods war. The technology battle between the US and China is perceived by the security establishment and others on a bipartisan basis in Washington as being an existential threat to US primacy in the world. And I don't think there is any doubt whatsoever that the US will continue to go hard after Huawei and other Chinese technology companies, despite the deal, which, as I said, I think will be signed off on trade. I also agree with what Mohammed El-Arian said back in November, anticipating this phase one deal, that it would be no more than a pause in the trade, as in trading goods war between the US and between the US and China. And I do think we will see a resumption of hostilities on the trading goods front once this election is done and dusted, irrespective of who we see in the White House come 20 January 2021. And that is simply something which is going to continue. And it is clear that corporate America has largely got that view on board. There was a survey carried out this year by the earlier last year, by the American Chamber of Commerce in China, which indicated that over 40% of American companies which are also established in China are considering or have already moved a significant part of their production out of China. So far, probably the biggest single beneficiary of that has been Vietnam. If you look at Vietnam's exports to the US for Q3 of last year, they were up by 22% relative to 2018. So you can see that there is actual movement taking place. I also think there's one other thing which you have to keep in mind about Donald Trump. And Robert Lighthizer, the US Trade Representative, was very, very clear about this in an interview he gave to Fox TV not long before Christmas. And that is that Trump wants to go after the EU on its perceived trade malfeasance from the perspective of Washington. And I do think we are going to see escalating trade tensions between Europe and the US during the course of this year. Nothing like as damaging to the global economy, I don't think, as China-US could have been, but certainly with the potential to continue to escalate, because the Europeans will not roll over. They will retaliate. There's no question about that. And at this stage, if you think about the issues that are at stake here, it's hard to see where Washington and Brussels would actually find common ground when we're talking about US farm product and so on and so forth, let alone the large civil aircraft dispute, which has actually been going on for about 20 years now. So I'm not particularly optimistic on the trade front, to be honest, but I don't think this deal is any big deal, as I said earlier. I think it's a small deal. I think it's a deal Trump could have had in March 2018, had he chosen to take it then, but he didn't, and we are where we are today, and markets have reacted in a positive sense, which I think is probably right if we look at US stock market in particular.
We've seen the global markets now at record highs, and this is also at a time when you have typically lower volumes because most of the large institutional investors are on holidays. So having said that, Maiti, if I could now come back to you, not a big trade deal. Are you also of the view of that it's not going to have much of an impact per se? We really need to watch for phase two whenever that actually happens, and the real stuff is being saved for post January 2021.
Oh yes, I would agree entirely with Alistair on this, that this trade deal, even if it does happen, would be not very significant at all. In fact, it might be almost insignificant, because let's understand that US-China trade wars are really a front. The US strongly resents and is very suspicious of China's dramatic rise as an economic power. So underlying this entire trade war is the fact that the US would like to ensure that China doesn't really become a threat to the US. And that's not going to be easy in today's situation, because China is a a growing power. In 1978, I think China's GDP was just about 6% of US GDP. But by last year, it was about 66% of US GDP. And that underlies the US fear and the various ruses that the US is taking to keep China down. At the same time, I also agree with Alistair that it's not so much trade in goods and services, but it's the fear of Chinese technology firms and the fact that they do steal technology. The respect for intellectual property rights is not remotely as where the US would like it to be. So these are all the underlying tensions. And I think these will remain regardless of who remains in the White House.
So if it is going to be not that significant, Shaukato, we have seen maybe now we have seen a positive reaction, whether it's knee-jerk at a time when volumes are typically lower. Shaukato, what I really want to understand from you then going forward is that it's been a tough ride for the emerging markets, right? Could that change if this is not significant? Will that be status quo then?
So, well, I mean, couple of points in here. Probably, I'm not going to debate how significant this deal is or not. So, I mean, this is definitely something which could have moved in an adverse direction, but it's probably likely to stabilize at some point in time. So, as a consequence of this, one is the movement on the rupee, the currency. So, because if this trade deal happens, we haven't seen the Chinese authorities using the renminbi or the CFETS index, the yuan, in any significant way to counter the trade slowdown. Initially, that had happened, that had reversed. So, I think fears of a major sharp depreciation is likely to come down. So, this is whether good or bad. Maithili will probably disagree. This is likely to impart more stability to the Indian currency. So, that's good news, one, from an investment point of view. That's one. Secondly, much of the Indian slowdown, I do not think has been caused by the global environment. Yes, exports are definitely down, but I don't think that the majority of the problems of the Indian growth slowdown are domestic. More than anything else, the government has to focus on removing some of these, irrespective of what the global economy is doing. There are multiple things on what the Fed, other central banks will do as a consequence of this deal, but and that will definitely have a peripheral impact on Indian policies. But I think this deal will, if anything, give both Indian monetary policy, Indian exchange rate policy, and domestic stimulus, whatever the nature of that stimulus, a little bit more room to maneuver, not be constrained by increasing financial markets volatility in the developed market, which has a spillover effect into all emerging markets, including India.
Okay, so we couldn't build a consensus on every issue over here, but I guess it's going to be one big theme that we're going to watch out for in 2020. Let's just say Donald Trump gave us a lot to talk about on the 1st of January. With that, I'd like to thank all three of you for joining us here on this edition of the India Development Debate. It is 1st of January, and you all very nicely agreed to be a part of our first edition of the India Development Debate this year. But with that, we're going to take a short commercial break. Stay tuned. You're watching the first episode of the India Development Debate in the new year 2020.